Hey everybody, it's the Knitting Professor, and I'm here today to look into the question of knitting and crafting as a spiritual practice. I have a very loudly purring cat with me, as well as a rather ailing dog who is currently being tested for Addison's disease. So, to the extent that spiritual practice includes your keeping a dog on your mind, Benny would love to have your thoughts and maybe a few prayers. I think we're on the way. But in any case, he's here and he's listening, and I can tell you what prompted me to look into this topic of knitting, crafting, and spiritual practice, and that is a small group that I am a part of. We're meeting tonight, and some of you know me, and you might even be in that group. Now, these are times that are challenging for many of us, especially us DEI-minded people. You know who I'm talking about. And I was inspired to get more involved in spiritual matters. I'll just say that this happened last November. So I'm pretty active on a weekly basis. And one of the things that I do for the group, it's a Zoom meeting, we discuss books. So I started reading this book today, and the instructions were to just sort of get started with it, read whatever, and I immediately jumped to the chapter on art. So I will link, if you're interested, this is called Faithful Practices, Everyday Ways to Feed Your Spirit, by Eric Walker Wickstrom as the editor. So there are multiple chapters in here. None of them is very long. And I dove into the one on art. The person who wrote that is named Amy Zucker Morgenstern. Making Art. It's about 10 pages long. So I also, I went off of this book, but I looked into some other dimensions, because as I was researching this question, it dawned on me, and this is true of my knitting as well. There are like two sides to knitting and crafting. There's the more meditative side, and then there's the more creative side. And sometimes they mesh, right? And sometimes it's like, nope, gotta be mindless. Other times it's like, I want to challenge myself. So I'm going to look at both of those dimensions. I would really like to know, if you're interested to toss some thoughts into the hat here, which dimension do you kind of see yourself as fitting into? More of the mindfulness, meditative side of knitting, crocheting, crafting, or more the creative, the challenging, the growth side? So let's kind of dig into each dimensions, and I'm going to start with the sort of meditative, repetitive side, and it's sort of an example of my own creation that aligns with that. Here is a sweater that is almost all stockinette. If I had any challenge at all, it was attaching the sleeves and doing the collar. So other than that, it was just watching this gorgeous, gorgeous, colorful Noro yarn go through my hands. I do have a video that I made on this sweater. I think I did it in English. Sometimes I forget what language I'm speaking. But I will try to link the video on the sweater as well. If I don't, just remind me. And I'm also going to do some more or less mindless, but also slightly creative knitting while I'm talking. So there are some basic dimensions to the meditative side of knitting, and those are connection, intention, mindfulness, and transformation, interestingly. So as far as meditative, the meditative dimension, I'm sure I don't have to tell you this, repetition. It's a very repetitive, especially something like this. This is all stockinette for the most part. I'll probably do some kind of a yoke. I'll be a little more creative on the yoke of this. This is my sock yarn sweater. I'm holding the sock yarn double, just trying to make good use of some of the remnants that I have from all the 20 pairs of socks I've made so far, to say nothing of the 20 pairs that I intend to make. So repetition, presence. That, you sort of quiet your mind and anchor your mind in the present. And, if you're lucky, you can kind of cancel out all those thoughts about what time it is. Is it? What do I have to do next? What's going on? Why am I here? And you can get into a kind of a Zen-like state of absorption. And I'm sure most of you know what I mean, right? It can be just so comforting. There's another aspect of this, which is a kind of an intentionality of it, making things for a certain purpose. And a lot of these purposes really align with the overall idea of love. So making garments for protection, for example, a sweater to protect someone's baby from the cold, or a hat to protect your own head or your child's head, or a blanket, to protect your grandmother when she's, watching TV. So love, connection, and I also see in this aspect of the meditative nature of knitting an ethical dimension of caring, caregiving, and protecting, and sort of, like a material realization of your love. So there's also the potential in knitting and crafting for a devotional practice. For example, I think there are probably people, and I think some of you have commented on this, like you enjoy knitting in the morning as the sun rises, or maybe you're a caregiver and you knit just to be with the person that you're looking after. And so maybe even in the hospital, or could be someone in hospice, if you're a caregiver, you're going to spend a lot of time with the person who may or may not even be able to respond to you, but you can be there and you can craft in a meditative way and just be present with that person. Compassion and service kind of align with this. I know some of you knit things for preemies, or you knit things for your friends, maybe friends who are grieving, or maybe new parents. I have a friend who does a certain kind of knitting for confirmands in their church. And there's even the potential to look on the labor, the time that you're investing in that work or that effort. It could even be deemed play. We're going to talk about that in a second. As viewing that investment of labor as a kind of a blessing, that you're extending a blessing to the person who's the recipient of your gift or your care or your protection. Another dimension of the meditative side of knitting is the therapeutic aspect of it. So reducing anxiety, healing, if you're recovering from something, it could be physical, it could be trauma, it could be just recovering from the situation that we're in today, then this kind of activity, be it, again, it could be felting, it could be spinning, it can have an effect of like solace in grief and just aid in healing, So that's another important quality or opportunity in knitting and crafting, is a spiritual practice. Just this whole opportunity to generate healing and promote healing. Another thing that it can give you is a sense of just agency, of just, every time I see a row emerge, I'm like, I made something. It's like when I'm out there mowing the lawn, you see a row of grass get sort of, the mosquitoes from that row are gone now, It's a sense of accomplishment and a sense of bringing order into chaos. You take fiber that is just a kind of a cottony wad and comb it and spin it and make yarn out of it, and then you make fabric out of that. There is a strong urge. I remember my doctoral advisor shared this idea with me that we have, as humans, a big need to bring order out of chaos, to apply reason to things that seem irrational. And stitching accomplishes that. Another dimension of this is the connection to our ancestors. And there's a notion of the sacred feminine, for example, and the whole lineage of caregiving and ways of knowing that center slowness and that center nurturing labor, as opposed to individual sort of ego-oriented accomplishment. I really like thinking about this because I'm currently in the last stages of editing my first novel, which is called The Ancestor, in my Romance at the Fiber Guild series. And the connection to the ancestors of the main characters is just primary. And I hope as I do my final edits, I want to make sure that I do justice to this theme of, the feeling that the young people have when they are knitting and spinning, of being sort of bound in a sacred way to the people who came before them and who brought them into being because of their, existing before them. And then, lastly, along the lines of the meditative spiritual practice of crafting is a material kind of spirituality. So many spiritual practices revolve around the opposite of the earthly, the ethereal, and they take us away from the material. And there's a big risk in that, because the more we allow ourselves to ignore nature's needs, the more damage we can do to it without feeling like we have to be accountable. So from that standpoint, I think crafting, making, stitching, spinning as a kind of material spirituality is extremely valuable, because it allows us an opportunity to remember how spirituality is actually found in the physical world. And it reminds us of the crucial importance of nurturing, stewarding, and protecting the physical world. So that covers the meditative side, the repetition, the relaxation part. Now, let's take a look at a more creative take on crafting as spiritual practice. So the 4 elements of this, they kind of relate to the first, but they build on it. So we have intention, attention, repetition, and correction. So there are a couple of phenomena going on there that align with the meditative dimension of knitting and crafting as spiritual practice, but there are 2 that sort of go beyond it, and attention is one of them and correction is the other. So let's dig into that. One thing that I haven't done, and there are going to be different definitions of this, but in the chapter, so in this book that I showed you, 4 dimensions of art, so the chapter was on art as a spiritual practice, were mentioned. Actually, more than that. So what constitutes a spiritual practice? It's one that brings about growth in the following areas. Wisdom, compassion, love, honesty, courage, faith, and a greater engagement with life. And just so you know, so in this book, that list is on page 153. So it's a chapter, Making Art by Amy Zucker Morgenstern. So those are the elements which she identifies as being in line with art as a spiritual practice. So, basically I'm asking, to what extent is knitting and crafting, to what extent is it art? And for a lot of us, it is, or we want it to be. So let's assume that knitting is art. And just for an example, so in this sort of mindless sweater, okay, the creative side lies in choosing the colors. So every time I end a skein, I'm knitting 2 different skeins, holding them double. So every time one ends, I got to pick a new one. And picking the new one, that's where the creative comes in. Because I want the colors to look pretty. I'll just say it that way. Just to show you what I mean. So currently, I'm knitting with these 2 yarns. Out of which I already made socks, but I had this much left over. So I'm holding these 2 literally together. So when I think I'm going to run out of the green first. Then I got to find another color. And here's a sweater that I knit that I think exemplifies creativity. Mind you, I did not invent everything. I invented the order and the arrangement of the motifs, but a lot of these motifs I found in books by Alice Starmore and reference books for Fair Isle knitting. So primarily Starmore, probably some Mucklestone as well. I recommend both. One of you actually recommended Starmore to me, which I appreciate because she needs all the recognition she can get. And as a matter of fact, I mentioned her in my novels. Okay. So, now when we engage in art, there are some challenges that can hinder us. And I'm going to go on record saying that when I think about a lot of these ideas, I also imagine myself in my role as writer, because obviously as a writer, I'm far more creative than I am with knitting. This pattern I followed, for example, 95% based on the book. This one right here. And I have a video on that. You can probably find it. So when we're trying to be artists and use art as a vehicle for spiritual practice, spiritual growth, some challenges that we can face are the over-involvement of our ego, and that can happen in any number of different ways. Perfectionism, I've certainly been guilty of that over the years. I'm also a musician, and when I was young, I thought I would go into music, and my perfectionist streak became a huge stumbling block because I got so nervous every time I made a mistake that it was just damning. So, I'm a musician, but I don't get paid much. Another issue that can come in, I think this, this can hold true for any professional activity. That's just laziness. Just sort of inertia. It's daunting to try to improve and grow and get better and be professional. So sometimes we're just like, I'm just not going to do anything, just going to hold off. And another risk with any kind of art and craft is isolation. So if you're like living in your ivory tower or whatever as a writer or an artist or even a knitwear designer, then you're missing out on the crucial element of human companionship. So at some point, I could do a video on art as community. I've certainly mentioned it in past videos, but that's a risk of the creative act. And in line with the whole ego thing is fear of judgment. Fear of judgment. I've heard so many people express this fear. Again, this comes up in my novel of, you create something for you that you want to wear, and it's just your own creative product, a dress, a jacket, a sweater, whatever it is, and then you're afraid to wear it because you're afraid people are going to judge you. Oh my gosh, you didn't buy that at H&M. You actually made that, So that's where the ego can trip us up, and we have to let go. Now, I'm going to show you, there's an interesting quote in here, and I had to mark it out because I was like, no, that's... and it was from Picasso. I'm going to go on record here as saying I'm not a fan of Picasso, who was a misogynist. And the quote goes, and God knows it has to be a translation, right? Did he say this in Spanish? Maybe? I'm not sure. Inspiration exists, but it has to find you working. Okay, so now I'm a Germanist, and I read the works of Friedrich Schiller. You German viewers, you know what I'm talking about. Schiller, right? Friedrich Schiller. He wrote this whole treatise on the importance of play. And so when I read this, I was like, I'm crossing that out, baby. I'm putting playing on there because it's not about working, baby. It's about playing. When you are trying to be creative, when you're trying to be artistic, it's about play. It's not about work. Sure, you have to be engaged in doing it, but if it's work, it's drudgery and it's no longer really very creative. It's like, we got to play hard, right? So if I want to be creative in my knitting and do something like this, I can't just be mindless anymore. I got to really think. I've got to do some calculating. I've got to get up and get down. I've got to have models. I've got to research. I've got to, think about colors, proportions, all this stuff. And again, it's not like fully my creation, although I intend to get more creative with my knitting and probably with like rug hooking and other stuff. So yeah, I think it's really important to play actively as a creator, as an artist, as a crafter. And that is how you experience the growth. You've got to be involved. And then there's the whole question of inspiration. So when we're just being mindful and meditative, inspiration could hit you, right? But if you're really wanting to go about this as a form of art, then you want to actively play and sort of prime the ground for inspiration to occur. And that entails active engagement. Another thing that I got out of the book, the article by Morgenstern, mediocrity is part of the growth process. So again, going back to the idea that you want to take risks, you don't want to be afraid of mistakes, that you have to just sort of know that making mistakes, that making things that end up being frogged is part of the process of making things that you're really proud of and that you really deem successful and satisfying. So there's the whole notion of caution versus risk taking. And it's really easy to be cautious because we want to be safe. It's, it's one of the core needs of humans is to be safe and secure and not feel like we're going to die in 5 minutes, right? That it's just like a natural knee-jerk reaction to not want to take a risk. But if you don't take a risk, guess what? You're not going to grow. You're not going to grow. There's also, so in line with this, the creative side is the need for enjoyment. It should be enjoyable, and it should be something that brings the viewers joy. So if someone sees the sweater that I created, I should be less afraid of them judging me and more optimistic that they will be maybe even impressed, that they will take some kind of joy in seeing the unique creation on me that came from my own hands and, at least to a degree, from my own mind. So it's important to look on art and crafting as something that we can enjoy, that we find satisfaction in, but that we can also approach with a degree of courage and boldness. So that kind of goes back a little bit to the initial list that I was quoting from Morgenstern about courage being a part of art crafting as spiritual practice. And then she mentioned something about the idea of non-attachment and how important it is to avoid self-judgment, to not get so caught up in like who we are as creators while we're creating that we can't let go. I can't have the same attitude towards what I make as what I have towards what my kids make. I have saved every crumb of every origami that my kid made for the 20th time during a church service, every drawing that they scratched like chicken scratch onto a scrap of paper. I saved it all because I'm like, my kid made that, yay. Now, that's just a symptom of my obsessive love for my children. I still have like 80% of all that stuff. They're not too happy about the fact that I still have all their schoolwork from when they were in like 3rd grade. We can't approach our own creativity that way and sort of expect that every scrap, every swatch deserves the same celebration as, the final product of months, maybe even years of effort into coming up with something that really sparkles, snaps, really just does it. So if we avoid being overly attached to every little stitch, then we can let go of the ones that just didn't pan out, and frog or whatever, and just not be so worried. Again, just be invested in the process and the enjoyment of the process, and not every detail, every minute spent that could be like wasted or whatever. And another thought that occurred to me while I was doing this reading, again, as a jazzer, so I improvise, and I'm also a scholar of language. Speaking is like the ultimate creative act, and improvising. So I'm a trumpeter. I have a long, deep history of playing jazz. And my father was also an improviser. He was an organist, and he would take the hymn that they did for the, whatever processional. And then during communion, when he's supposed to just kind of make pretty noise, he would just do a ride on that. You could hear that he was basically playing the hymn, but he was taken in all kinds of different directions. He was improvising. So what's going on there is we're dealing with the language. So I want to sort of posit knitting, crocheting, all of these crafts as like jazz. It's basically a foundational language, or like a canvas, in which we can invest our own creative juices, ideas, on which we can paint our own creative riffs, you know. To me, that's the creative dimension of knitting. And I would be really curious. I'm going to guess that like a lot of us don't do that. We're more meditative crafters, meditative knitters. But some of you are. I've, heard some people comment as fiber artists, and I certainly seek out fiber artists. And in my novels, I have fiber artists left and right, who definitely are on the really super creative side of crafting, and really emulating the potential of these like fibery languages to express new, meaningful things. So the process is probably what we need to keep our eyes on, is like, quote, the prize. And the product is what can develop if we really allow ourselves that non-judgmental freedom to take matters into our own hands, boldly, courageously, lovingly, and at the same time, regardless of which approach you're taking to your crafting, I think being present is sort of key. And doing it in whatever way brings you the satisfaction, the joy, the calm, the reward that you personally seek from that crafting. So that's what I have to share with you today. For you German viewers, I love you. I will do something in German tomorrow, and look forward to that. I appreciate everyone. Got a lot of new subscribers. It's just wonderful. Recently, I did a sort of a self-introduction video. If you're interested in having me do that again, feel free to let me know that. Making progress with the novels. I also have my website, my author website, linked, and I come up with a little newsletter. It's very brief, just a lot of fun, every couple weeks, just to kind of keep you updated. And I found yesterday a very nice beta reader for like the final draft of the novel I'm working on to get out later this summer. So hopefully, yeah, that will pan out and you'll actually get to see what I'm up to as an author. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this video. I look forward to your comments, which I appreciate very much. And I hope you have an awesome weekend. Take care. Bye.